welcome to Crossroads. I'm Nicholas Tavitian, and I have a special guest for you today on Crossroads. As you know, we've been discussing Europe and Armenia on the program. That's what the program is about. But a few days ago, the US Vice President made something of a historical visit to Armenia and to Azerbaijan. And now there's a visit by Pezeshkian, Iran's president, that has been announced. So he'll be coming to Armenia soon. And all the while, Armenia still, of course, has a significant Russian presence on its territory, and it has increasingly close relation with France and the European Union. So Armenia really is now, more than ever, at the crossroads of many great powers. And this broadcast will focus on trying to clarify its geopolitical context. And to discuss this, I am very happy to welcome the ideal person to enlighten us on the subject of geopolitics, of Armenia's geopolitics, and of the region's geopolitics. I present Marat Terterov. Marat, welcome to Crossroads.
Thank you, Nicholas. It's great to be here. Thank you very much.
Marat, you are an acclaimed expert and practitioner of international relations. That's your general area of competence. You studied at Oxford University, where you did a doctorate, mostly about the Middle East's political economy. Your expertise has a lot to do with global energy investments, with international geopolitics, of course, but energy security in particular. You worked with a Brussels-based Energy Charter Treaty Organization. You lectured at Brussels Kent's University for many years, and now you run the Brussels Energy Club, which is a corporate networking platform, I think very present in European circles. And of course, you contribute in many ways to the public and academic debate on these geopolitical questions with a focus on energy. So, Marat, as I mentioned, I would like to start with Vance's visit, with the American Vice President's visit to Armenia and Azerbaijan. There was, of course, a very important meeting at the White House last August between Pashinyan, Aliyev, and President Trump. And that meeting could have been just a flash in the pan, one of Trump's great ideas with no follow-up. But that wasn't to be the case. And throughout the autumn and the winter, 25-26, we've had very active negotiations between the US and Armenia in particular. And now we have Vance's visit, which gives additional substance to the TRIPP, the Trump route for international peace and prosperity that runs along Armenia's southern border. But there's been more, of course. There's an agreement on nuclear investments in Armenia. There's an agreement for America to sell weapons, and in particular, very advanced drones to Armenia. What did I forget? Of course, there's a massive investment in AI infrastructure in a data center in Armenia, if I understand things properly. So that's a very, the relationship, the presence of the United States in Armenia is becoming very substantial. Would you say that the US now is present, is one of the key actors in the Caucasus? Are they there for good? And what motivates their presence, this year's initiatives?
Well, Nicholas, thanks very much. These are actually great and not insubstantial questions. We can actually discuss just those very questions for a very long time. But I think in order to directly come to you and to respond to those, yes, this has been a big week in terms of U.S. visibility, U.S. presence at a very high level in the Southern Caucasus, in Armenia and Azerbaijan. It is a big statement. In some ways, one could almost be tempted and talk about this as a game-changing moment in terms of U.S. policy towards the Southern Caucasus, because most of us who have been around for a while and have an institutional memory remember that under President Obama, for example, there was a really big pivot towards Asia, sort of the Pacific, whereas now we see a very active sort of foreign policy from the Trump administration reaching into many, many global hotspots, you can say. Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of visibility of the Trump administration in conflict zones, of course, starting with Ukraine. This is part of the campaign trail, but India, Pakistan, Cambodia, and Thailand. Asia, Armenia, and Azerbaijan. These are kind of not the most obvious areas that we would have expected American foreign policy to be so actively engaged in. Nevertheless, we do see this, and not surprisingly, there's a lot of media attention towards this visit. So just let's have a look at this a little bit closer and try to understand what this means in reality, the Vance visit. Well, first of all, is it a game-changing moment? I would say probably more no than yes. So first of all, I think it's important to actually mention that Armenia has been a major, let's say, area of interest for U.S. foreign policy since the collapse of the Soviet Union. Yeah, so in the 1990s, countries like Armenia, as well as Ukraine, were very significant recipients of foreign aid from the United States, driven by certain, let's say, domestic interests within the United States who had some sympathy towards those countries. And bearing in mind, I myself was born in the Soviet Union in what is now Ukraine, in the city of Odessa.
Yes, I didn't mention that in the introduction, but you're a former Soviet citizen, and then you became Australian, and now you're also European because you've been spending, almost 20 years here.
Yes, that's right, Nicholas. I started life as what one can say is homicus sovieticus, and then my family actually emigrated to Australia in the 1970s. So I grew up in Australia, but then I returned to Europe in my 20s, and very much have been working with the former Soviet Union for the past 25 years. Yes, my PhD was on the Middle East, on Egypt, but as a practitioner, I've worked with the countries of the former Soviet Union on an ongoing basis since the late 1990s. Right. And in fact, my first visits to the Southern Caucasus were in 1997. So I've been following, let's say, U.S. presence in that region and European presence in that region for a good 25, 28 years or so. So that's why I'm taking you back a little bit and referring to that U.S. sort of foreign aid kind of, it's a bit of an umbilical cord in some ways, underscoring political.
So the U.S. was interested in supporting Ukraine and Armenia in the 1990s.
Very much so, very much so. If you look at actually what was happening in Ukraine, there was quite a lot of money put into economic reform activities, privatization, facilitation of private sector development, Armenia as well, but Armenia a much smaller country than Ukraine, of course. But nevertheless, in Armenia, it actually worked quite a lot because the Armenian economy went through a much, let's say, speedier and less traumatic liberalization process than did Ukraine. In Ukraine, we had a maybe one step forward, two steps back sort of experience with a lot of governance issues as well, I would say, in Ukraine's case. But nevertheless, Armenia was an area of very significant interest of U.S. foreign policy. The Southern Caucasus more broadly were an area of interest because there was a lot of...
So your argument is that we are not at a pivotal moment because the US has always been interested in Armenia? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, I think the jury's still out from my perspective. I mean, this is an important visit, don't get me wrong. The presence of someone like J.D. Vance in Yerevan, and more importantly, the fact that he's in Yerevan and Baku, visiting the two, doing a form of, shuttle... I don't want to call it shuttle diplomacy. This is a kind of Kissingerite terminology, but nevertheless, shuttle activities and demonstrating activism. But let's just try to think what's behind this. What are some of the objectives? What's in the mind of some of these top-notch decision makers in Washington? And is it really to promote peace and prosperity and development in the region? Probably yes, broadly speaking, I would say, because it is in the interest of the United States, all significant global powers, be they Russia, China, Europe, and I do repeat, Russia, China, Europe, to have peace and development in that region because they will make money from this. This is an economic bet, you see. So, I mean, using politics to stabilize an environment is a significant platform for business development. Okay, so we're going to talk about this a little bit later in this discussion, but I think all those countries do have an interest in peaceful, prosperous sort of Southern Caucasus, Armenia, Azerbaijan. Yeah, but don't forget, I mean, the U.S. Were very active. U.S. diplomacy was very active in the Southern Caucasus initially to push through oil and gas pipelines through that region, connecting Caspian oil and later Caspian gas sort of reserves, deposits, particularly in the Azerbaijan sector of the Caspian Sea, towards European markets.
Of course, yeah.
And Kazakhstan as well, by the way.
Yes.
So this is really important. And this helped, of course, Azerbaijan develop a relationship with the United States, because during the time of the First Karabakh War in the mid-1990s, early 90s, I would say, there was more a tendency for U.S. to be somewhat standoffish towards Azerbaijan in terms of its foreign policy engagements, and, not necessarily endorse Armenia openly, but let's say not be an active broker in peace, and more thinking about like some of these pipelines. And the pipelines had a geopolitical element. I mean, we here in Brussels like to demonize Russia and criticize Russia for its weaponization of energy. But nevertheless, if you actually look at these initial pipelines conceived in the 1990s,
yes,
and then came on stream in the 2000s, like Baku-Tbilisi-Ceyhan, the Caspian Pipeline Consortium, some of the gas pipelines running from Azerbaijan to Georgia, these were very much supported by Washington.
Right, and now also TAP and TANAP. In other words, the gas pipelines that bring Azerbaijani gas to the Mediterranean Sea.
TAP and TANAP, less so, I would say, in terms of U.S. Public support, public diplomacy.
They got major European funding.
Exactly. I mean, Brussels was very much a supporter of what was called the Nabucco pipeline,
right?
Okay, and which turned out to be the TANAP gas pipeline, linking Azerbaijan, Shahdiz to gas field to Europe through Turkey, of course. But the Americans were not really behind.
I see. You're making the distinction between Europe and the United States.
Exactly.
That's very useful. But coming back to the key question, so
Sure.
This is not a turning point. It's just a business visit?
I think the jury's still out. I think, certainly Washington, with its, let's say, business-driven foreign policy, you can call it something like that, a foreign policy which puts business and economy and deal-making in the economic sense to the forefront of foreign policy.
Right.
Okay, so we can see that, for example,
because I think what's at the back of the mind of many Armenians, anyway, is now that there is so much American money or so many American business interests in the Caucasus, will they now pay more attention to stability? Will they now prevent the next war? I think that's the key consideration here.
I think we're going to get into a discussion here about geopolitical risk in a moment, but I don't think that's the immediate, let's say, logic or reckoning behind these visits, or even behind the what's called now TRIP, or what the Azeris call Zangezur sort of corridor. Yeah, I think it's still more about, let's say, sending a message that business can be a powerful, let's say, tool to ameliorate or mitigate against conflict and help to cement peace. That message we've been seeing, or exchange of those ideas, in the Russia-Ukraine, American, let's say, negotiations over the war in Ukraine, because of course we've seen this critical rare earths sort of deal discussion in terms of Ukraine. They've been pushing that onto the Ukrainians. We don't know much about that deal in reality. How it's going to benefit Ukraine. Is it going to benefit Ukraine? How's it going to work? Same with the Alaska talks and the energy deals, between the Russians and the Americans. This is being thrown out as a carrot, but we don't have much, let's say, information about that.
Right.
So similar on a smaller scale in Armenia, in the Southern Caucasus, this carrot of business deals is being thrown out there. And I think ultimately, I do believe in economy as a, let's say, not a deal breaker in a conflict situation, but as something that can cement peace. Okay, because let's say if you do get a bona fide peace agreement between Armenia and Azerbaijan, we're not there yet. The economic, let's say, deepening of the relationship is something that's going to cement the peace treaty. Without that, we're going to be in very, let's say, still very unsolid sort of ground.
I got it. Well, look, this is a very sobering thought, a very sobering commentary. We shouldn't expect that just because Vance and a lot of American investment has arrived to Armenia, that therefore America is guaranteeing anything. But it is a positive dynamic that will hopefully influence the peace dynamic favorably.
I think it'll give a lot of confidence to Armenia and Armenians, okay, as people. Armenia is a great business nation, great trading nation, whether inside Armenia itself or, at the global level. So I think something like this and talk about all of this business, all of these investments, it'll give confidence to the market in a sense, yeah? But I, again, underscore that the jury is still out from my perspective because we see a lot of high-level visits all over the place, whether it's Russians going with their delegations to Saudi Arabia, whether it's, Turks coming to Europe or Americans going to Latin America. It's when the money's in the bank that's when it starts to count. And I think we're not there yet.
Right.
But, it's a positive, let's say, development. And also, we need a little bit more information, I think, about Vance's visit to Azerbaijan. Because Azerbaijan, let's say, like all countries, be they rich or poor countries, it needs money, it needs investment. But Azerbaijan is not doing too badly right now in terms of the capital that the Azeri economy itself is mobilizing, not just on the back of hydrocarbons, let's say, sales and exports, but also through the power sector, through, other aspects of the energy economy. So I think, for Azerbaijan, the game will be a little bit different than it is for Armenia.
Yes.
They're on a high ground, obviously, in terms of the military political sort of dynamic with the Armenians at the moment. But that part of the equation of the Vance visit is going to be no less important than all this hype about, deals and potential money coming into Armenia.
Got it. So talking about Azerbaijan, that's a country you're familiar with, and you've been in you've had a lot of contact with Azerbaijani officials. You even have met Aliyev, I believe, more than once. So you have a better feel for the most of us, a better feel than most of us, as to what their approach is to the conflict, beyond the rhetoric and beyond the media coverage. What's your assessment of the dynamics that are now in place? We've had since the end of the 2020 Karabakh war, we've had negotiations. The EU has had a go at trying to mediate. Didn't work so well. Then the US is now trying, but it seems to be taking an awfully long time. Whereas the object of the conflict, which was Karabakh itself, is now in Azerbaijani hands. As far as we know, the Armenian government is ready to sign tomorrow. So how do you, rather not what's holding out? We know what's holding out. There are conditions on Azerbaijan's side. But how do you assess the dynamic and the prospects for peace in the foreseeable future?
Well, I would start by saying that most of the leaders of the post-Soviet states or the countries of the former Soviet Union are in some ways very good chess players, and in some ways very good also business-oriented personalities. They may not necessarily be businessmen or business people, but there's a very strong business orientation. The former Soviet space, it's a little bit like the countries of the GCC, the Gulf Arab countries, but with a much harder power sort of dynamic to them than the GCC countries, who tend to, let's say, import security,
Right.
And don't engage in it as directly, compared to the former Soviet Union. So I think it's important to make that statement initially, because if these people who are very smart, very worldly, intelligent in an intellectual sense, in an educated sense, but also very streetwise, these people look at both the development of their countries, the region, all the little pieces of the chessboard, the puzzle, and how you can navigate and maneuver in this sort of environment. And the extrapolation from this is that if there's a good deal on the table, I'm interested to talk to you, okay, whatever that deal is, So now if we move to Azerbaijan specifically, and I've described the bigger sort of framework of leadership mindset, President Aliyev, who, and I said this on Armenian TV, who I honestly think from my meetings with him directly, is a clever man, is a very, very clever person, a chess player and an intelligent person. So President Aliyev at the moment, I would think, is evaluating whether the current gains that have been achieved by Azerbaijan based on the military events of 2020 through to 2022, 23, whether that is the maximal gain or the best deal on the table that is attainable, let's say, And this refers not just to, I know what some maybe of your audience is thinking, they're thinking land grabs, they're thinking West Azerbaijan community sort of narratives, how serious, or is this a smokescreen? This is perfectly logical questions for Armenians and friends of Armenia, including people like myself, who's, part Armenian. My original name, as you know, is Terterov.
Yes.
But it's not just about the military and political dynamic, I think. I think it's more about really what can be done in the South Caucasus in the future. What sort of vision can we have for the South Caucasus in the future? And I've tried to discuss this with the president, Aliyev. And I've tried to instill this idea that, okay, sovereignty, this is not the start and the end of the story. Okay, we, for example, live in Europe. We have a different concept and different, let's say, implementable utilization of sovereignty, both as a concept and as a practice. For us, borders are less important now in our DNA. We've gone through a certain history, particularly in Northwest Europe. Europe is also different. But here in Northwest, Benelux countries, borders are almost a thing of the past. So I would think that this question predicates to some thinking of like where we are now, what is the best that I can achieve? Is this, if I lock myself into a legally binding agreement, is this the best that I can achieve both in the military, political, security sense, but is it also the best that I can achieve in an economic sense? So that's why I was saying the Vance visit to Baku is very important, because we don't know what they're talking about in private. We don't know what they're talking about in terms of investments, business, cooperation, companies like Sokhar, the national oil company of Azerbaijan.
But just to dig a little bit further along those lines. So you claim Aliyev is thinking strategically in terms of what additional gains can he make. And again, not primarily territorial, but economic.
Exactly.
But so you can always ask yourself that question. I won't sign now because tomorrow could be better. There could be new opportunities. But you need some idea of what opportunities you're waiting for. Otherwise, waiting makes no sense, right? So what do you think he's waiting for? What sort of opportunities?
Well, I'm not sure if the idea of a a Southern Caucasus confederation and the economic benefits that can bring, that type of framework, is instilled in his mind at the moment?
I doubt it. He never mentioned that that I know of, and maybe it's a bit premature for his own population too.
Well, the population is another thing. We need to discuss that. But in terms of, politics in South Caucasus, even Armenia, Georgia, it's still top-down. There's still a very heavy top-down. You can discuss this, and there's certainly, you can argue about Armenian civil society, Azeri civil society in different ways. There'll be, of course, perceptions that people have. But politics for me in the former Soviet Union is still top-down, okay? In terms of Aliyev on the question of the broader South Caucasus and economic sort of, union of some kind, this idea is not new to him. It has been discussed. So I've been in meetings myself, and I think you could even maybe get some of these now on YouTube, where he has discussed the establishment of, let's say, task forces, economic committees comprised of Armenians, Azeris, Georgians working together and talking about economic cooperation. I can also tell you that there are channels of communication between Azerbaijan government structures and Armenian state structures on economic cooperation. So this is happening. This is a fact.
Right, but in order to suspend the signing of a peace treaty, I mean, all these things can still be done after a peace treaty, right? If he wants to, Azerbaijan to build a new infrastructure to the benefit of both countries, that can be done after the signing of a peace treaty. You would only withhold the signing of a peace treaty if you need to force your partner into a new concession.
Again, I think the point is here is that I'm not convinced that he has arrived at a point, and not just Aliyev, but also, let's say, other stakeholders in, kind of interface discussions on these sort of things, who may not only be in Azerbaijan, by the way. They can be in Turkey, they can be in Russia to some degree. There is massive connections between Moscow and Baku, in terms of business relationships, families. These are sovereign states, but business does not recognize sovereign borders, sort of in many ways.
Yes.
So I think we should not underestimate the value of these sort of links and connections. So I'm just not convinced at the moment that, and also, if I'd be President Aliyev, why would I kind of rush into a peace treaty right now when there's still a lot of open questions about the South Caucasus, when there's still a lot of open questions about the wider geopolitical space in which the South Caucasus is located? What would be Russia's reaction, if a peace treaty would be signed? What would be Iran's reaction, if a peace treaty would be signed? What would be Iran's and Russia's reactions to more presence of American activity, both from a military security perspective as well as pure business and economic perspective in the South Caucasus? How many, to what degree would existing entrenched business interests be disrupted by this type of presence? These are questions that I'm sure are running through the minds of the people in Azerbaijan.
Got it. Look, you mentioned Russia.
Yep.
I think it's fair to say that the Armenian political opinion to some extent is divided between people who are very excited that the EU and the United States are now interested in Armenia, sufficiently interested for the kind of investments that are being made on the part of the EU and Armenia, and those who think that Russia cannot be Armenia cannot be saved by the West. Russia will always be present in the Caucasus, and they will be back, and that is a necessary alliance. And rather than counting on the West for its security, Armenia should ensure that it mends ties with Russia, or at least retains good ties with Russia. Could you comment on that in the light, of course, of the EU's interest in Armenia, but especially of Vance's visit?
Well, it's a balancing act, so that's for sure. And you have to have a look at the entire history, let's say modern history of Armenia, maybe even starting from, early 19th century, and its more or less kind of incorporation into the Russian Empire, where the kingdoms, let's say mountainous kingdoms of the Armenian, Georgian sort of lands were located. These have always been between these greater powers, located between greater powers, the Persian Empire, the Ottoman Turkish Empire, Russian Empire. So, they've always been Georgians, Armenians, in a kind of a complex situation. So
yes, I think we may need to remind some of our listeners that what is now the South Caucasus was essentially Persian territory until the beginning of the 19th century, until the early 1800s, 1828, basically.
Exactly. And not just that, but also that the Russian Empire, which from, let's say, the early 19th century started expanding southwards, the Ottoman Turkish Empire and the Persian Empire, there was a constant set of rivalries. There was constant rivalry between these great powers. And the kingdoms of Georgia, Armenia, which were located in those regions, were always kind of between a rock and a hard place. Who do we go to be protected? The natural pivot of the Christian, Armenian, and Georgian peoples of the region were to gravitate towards protection under the Russian Tsar, from the Ottomans. But then again, as you yourself know, Nicholas, because I think both of our family ancestries originate from what is today Eastern Turkey. So we do understand that a lot of, let's say, Christian Armenians also lived in the Ottoman Empire. Yeah. So, it was a complex situation of ethnicities. The concept of nation states was not as developed as it is today at the time. So in some ways, if you bring that history fast forward 200 years, we come to a similar situation today. Armenia, Georgia, Azerbaijan, these are located geographically between Russia, Turkey, Iran, which are bigger, more powerful states of the region. And then you have the more global actors, like the United States, like European Union, like China, sort of also projecting, let's say, economic influence, political power sort of in the region. So I guess where we're coming to, and where we're coming to your specific question about Armenia, is that I would love to see a regional sort of environment in the South Caucasus where small countries do not need to make hard choices, where small countries should be kind of, let's say, more supported rather than pressured between rivalries in order to allow them to develop their own model, their own economic and foreign policy sort of trajectories, yeah? So I'd love to see a country like Armenia take the best from the West, US, Europe, in terms of technology, in terms of governance, in terms of, finance and investment, which is suitable for Armenia's sort of development, and also the best from the East, from China, from Russia, from the Gulf Arabs, because none of these, a lot of supporters of Armenia, friends of Armenia in Europe, the West, they would literally love to take Armenia physically on their shoulders and relocate it somewhere to southern France, and same with Georgia. These are our Christian people. Armenia has the first Christian church, as beautiful ones as they are. I was in Yerevan last Easter, and we had fantastic visits to these magnificent Christian, churches and important monasteries. Same in Georgia. So, we have a sense of ownership over this. We feel that these are our people, yeah? And we want to protect these people. We want to empower them economically.
We being you and me, or
no,
or
we
the
being
West?
Europeans,
Okay.
the West, our kind of, let's say, ownership narrative. Yeah, and don't forget, many of us, like myself, my family emigrated from the Soviet Union to Australia in the 1970s. You have ancestry also from Eastern Turkey. So, we have been kind of, let's say, socialized and educated in a certain way where we feel that, these people, these countries should be part of us, part of our club. Yeah. Now, that's all good and well, but the reality on the ground is quite different because Russia is not going to go away. Okay. So you go to Moscow, you go to Russia, there is probably as many Armenians living in Russia as there is in Armenia. I haven't done a head count, but and these people, they all speak Russian. They're not like yourself or people from the Armenian diaspora in Lebanon or France, who are essentially French Armenians or westernized Lebanese Armenians, whatever. Yeah, in Russia, there's still a post-Soviet mentality. Their behavior is different, their approach is different, the relationships are different. So that is not going to go away. We should not try to, let's say, indirectly threaten the rupture of that relationship by de facto trying to put Armenia on our shoulders and take it to southern France.
And so I think you're making me think of a recent article you wrote
Yeah.
about pivoting.
Yeah.
That are countries like Armenia and the others in the South Caucasus, and in fact countries like Ukraine and Moldova too, should be able to pivot. In other words, or to balance between the great powers that are their neighbors. So clearly that should be possible. Are you saying it is the European Union's policies, or maybe Russia's policies, don't allow them to balance between their neighbors?
Yeah, that's roughly correct.
That's your point. Okay.
That's roughly correct. There's a bigger discussion here between Russia and the European Union, which I would argue is not allowing these countries to develop in their own independent way because they're being put into a position where they have to choose one or the other. And I don't think that is the way that they should develop. Like I said earlier, I think they should be allowed to pick the best from the West and pick what they need and want from the East or from whichever partners.
Can you be more specific? What is it that the EU or the US do that prevents, that makes it difficult for a country like Armenia to balance?
Well, I think in terms of Armenia, for example, free trade agreements, in some ways this is good, yeah. But this is something that is perceived by Russia as an encroachment into an area which some people call a sphere of influence. But what exactly does sphere of influence mean? Sphere of influence can be political, it can be also economic, it can be cultural, so you have to take that in a much broader way. But the knee-jerk reaction from, let's say, Russia as a state to European, let's say, encroachment through free trade sort of agreement, other forms of instruments, various types of aid, neighborhood policies backed by funds, by money, is a knee-jerk reaction is that we have to make our presence felt as well, okay? And that puts pressure on the one in between, okay? And, you can expand this discussion, talk about NATO and CSTO, for example, rivalries at a sort of military security bloc sort of sense, and where do countries like Georgia have to go? We shouldn't put these countries in that position. Countries like Kyrgyzstan, for example, in Central Asia, also in this position. Americans wanted a military base in Kyrgyzstan. This was not necessarily welcomed by Russia. So it creates a kind of complex situation for the small power. And I think what we should really do is support the small power. Listen to them. Don't tell them what is good for them, which I think is much of the premise coming out of Brussels is you should do this, you should do that, this is what you should do, this is what you shouldn't do. These are not kids, these are not children. They have a good idea what they need themselves in many ways. So let them develop themselves, offer them, assistance of their identification. Let them identify the type of assistance that they need.
Could we say more flexibility on the part of the EU
much
in its
more.
relationship
Exactly.
with
EU has a one-size-fits-all approach, okay? And a one-size-fits-all approach is basically like American carpet bombing in Vietnam, to wake up some of your listeners in a sense.
Yes.
It's
I'm not sure they would approve of the parallel, though.
Fair enough. I'm trying to be a little bit provocative, here in that sense. I mean, not everything coming out of Russia is bad. We shouldn't default think that everything about Russia is bad. And let's think about how we treated Russia and dealt with Russia in the 1990s. Was Russia a threat to European security or American security in the 1990s? Russia was not a threat. Russia was a threat to itself. In the 1990s, a country was on the verge of imploding economically, criminal-wise. So we could have done much more to work with Russia, offer Russia a better deal, which would have forced less reaction from Russia to try to keep countries like Ukraine in its orbit. By the year 2000, Russia was the biggest foreign direct investor in Ukraine. It wasn't the US, it wasn't Europe. It was Russian companies that actually went into Ukraine.
Right.
And in many ways, when we started peeling Ukraine away from Russia by, let's say, supporting the Orange Revolution, this resulted in Russian seeing that its economic interests are under threat. Security interests as well, sort of later on. But the knee-jerk reaction, you got to understand the character of Russia. There's a great powerness. There's a sense of preponderance there as well. So we could have behaved very differently with Russia. And if we look at, the region in terms of a win-win, let's try to, make a win-win scenario for all players and not compel countries to choose between East or West.
That's a very strong point. I'd like to conclude with a question about the European Union. Before I do, what you were talking about just now, really makes me think of the years 2013 and 2014, because everybody in Europe knows about Maidan and how the chain of events that was triggered originally by the decision of the initial decision of the Ukrainian president not to sign the association agreement with the EU, which was primarily a free trade free trade agreement. The same agreement was on the agenda of negotiations with Armenia. Those negotiations had concluded, and Armenia was ready to sign, but at the last minute, they too decided not to sign. In both countries, that's another parallel between the two countries, there was a crisis that year that was caused by initially by Russia's reaction to a trade agreement, but the trade agreement meant that these people would have to tone down, reduce their trade relations, their economic integration with Russia in favor of greater economic integration with the European Union. So that makes your case that the EU forced them to choose and essentially provoked a reaction in Moscow. I'd like to move straight on to a question about the European Union. One gets the impression that the EU, and it's been a sort of ongoing theme in these in this program, that the EU has had trouble formulating a strategy towards the Caucasus. And over the years, when there was a big move to make, the US was always first, and the EU followed. I remember that in 2009, Obama sponsored negotiations between Armenia and Turkey, sort of to open the border. This was never materialized, but nevertheless, it wasn't the EU that brokered this deal. It was the American president. And there have been other incidences of the kind, including in 2022, when it was first Nancy Pelosi, who was, of course, Speaker of the House in the U.S. Congress, and of the same party as the president. So she went to Armenia, denounced Azerbaijan's attack on Armenian territory proper, And it's only following that the EU then became interested in the country and sent monitors.
Yeah.
So one gets the impression that the EU has always had to follow Washington, had always needed Washington's permission before making a move.
Yeah.
Is there any sign that this the decoupling is actually happening in the Caucasus? The EU now is able to develop its own strategy in the Caucasus?
Well, it's a kind of a elongated question. I think maybe one or two key points here. So the European Union was not really conceived and has never really, let's say, been qualified to become a kind of a geopolitical actor. Okay. You've had the formation of the European External Action Service. We had DG Relics before that. So it's like a foreign sort of service component. But it's never really been, let's say, a serious geopolitical actor with any teeth. The only teeth that it has is economic instruments, various trade, let's say, instruments, but more particularly maybe sanctions as an instrument. And these instruments are not sufficient to project enough power to make other significant, let's say, global actors change their behavior. These instruments are not sufficient. We, on the one hand, don't live in the 19th century anymore, but nevertheless, hard power and the ability to project hard power is still the game breaker. It's still the ultimate arbiter that can actually back.
Are you saying you cannot have a proper foreign policy or strategy towards a region of the world if you don't have hard power to back it up?
Yeah, I would say that.
Also, economic power is not enough, for instance.
It's not enough, absolutely not, particularly in the former Soviet Union, where politics is always ahead of economic policies. If that would not have been the case in the former Soviet Union, we already would have had a South Caucasus economic union, okay, because I've been preaching this idea for a very long time, and I've discussed it with decision makers and pushed the idea. But we're held back by politics and even geopolitics, including the projection of hard power. Okay, so I've been to, Karabakh region on several occasions in recent years. I've seen military presence of Azerbaijan. I've seen Russian peacekeepers. I've seen, a lot of military hardware in the region. And this is the arbiter. This is basically what keeps, let's say, the political force is backed by military force. So you cannot escape this in today's world. The European Union simply does not have, let's say, a direct military hard power capacity to back anything that it really wants to enforce anywhere, really, I would say. Sanctions are not enough. Economic instruments are not enough. You can see sanctions, Russia, 20 packages. There's a lot of people saying, wow, the Russians' economy is in crisis, all this sort of stuff. Yeah, I've been to Russia, several times in recent times, and I speak to people in Russia all the time, and maybe in the long term, Russian economy will decline, but in the long term, we're all dead. So we've got the climate change situation coming up. So long term, I didn't think the situation in Russia is going to change in the next few years.
Yes.
In terms of economic pressure on the country. Yeah, but. If you look at the main geopolitical players in the world today, Russia, China, United States, these are sovereign states. These are still sovereign states which manage to use their sovereignty to mobilize their power. They have a monopoly on their power. European Union is not a sovereign state. It is still a kind of a project which, it has its operational culture.
Of course, it's an intergovernmental organization where 27 member states have to agree.
European Union is a set of treaties which has created institutions but these institutions together are not a sovereign state which can wield any hard power. Of course, European Union has close cooperation with NATO. We see constantly, all these high-level meetings, but NATO and the European Union are not in sync 100% with each other. You can see right now on the whole Greenland fiasco, about what is happening with NATO. We don't even know its future. NATO itself is a coordinational alliance. It's not a sovereign state.
Right. So you're saying the EU is not a sovereign state, has no military power.
Correct.
Therefore, we cannot expect that it will develop a strategy in the Caucasus?
Well, no, I didn't say that because what does strategy mean? Okay, so the EU cannot develop let's say, a genuine political strategy or a geopolitical strategy which can be backed by some form of, force if that strategy is not somehow developed adequately. But the EU certainly has tried to develop a strategy towards the South Caucasus, I would say. It has not been successful because, in essence, its strategy has been part of these kind of neighborhood programs. Okay, so, Eastern Partnership, kind of the Mediterranean strategies towards North Africa, all of these sort of instruments which are supported by various forms of aid, sort of donor assistance to the region. They're more for development of governance, for economic sort of cooperation frameworks, social frameworks, European norms of plurality, LGBT sort of movements, all these sort of things. Yeah. So this is a package of, let's say, EU projected benefits for the region. If you can call that a strategy or not, I'm not sure. However, I would say to you, just to sort of be brief on this point, that if you would ask me what would the EU like in the South Caucasus, I would say to you the following. It would like to bring Georgia back in. So current Georgian government is very much seen on a kind of pro-Russian sort of path, whereas under Saakashvili, it was a kind of pro-Western path. So I think EU would like to see Georgia pivot back towards the West, at least in a political orientation.
Yeah.
It would probably like to, let's say, keep cooperation with Azerbaijan as it is at present, which is essentially an energy partnership, energy cooperation. So Azerbaijan is a contributor to European energy security, not only on the gas side, but also on renewable energy, as well as it's an oil supplier. And with Armenia, probably to try to bring Armenia in as much as possible into some form of pre-accession relationship. And it would like to bring Georgia back onto an accession path. So I think, that you could say is a form of a strategy towards the three countries, but towards the South Caucasus. And that's probably what, in the External Action Service or in some of the relevant DGs, they would like to see in the South Caucasus. But the bigger problem here is, Nicholas, is the EU has never got its, if you can call it that, a Russia strategy. It's never got its Russia strategy right. And that's the bigger problem because Russia's not going to go away. And if you want to work with those countries, including Ukraine, you need to get your Russia strategy right. That's not an easy task, by the way, but you need to somehow improve that strategy or improve that relationship. And at the moment, that has gone down to the lowest form of relationships that we have ever seen.
Marat, we'll have to leave it there.
Yep.
But I think your message is loud and clear. There is no Caucasus strategy without a Russia strategy. And at the risk of having reduced your message to the excess, because this has been an extremely rich conversation, I think very enlightening, I'd like to thank you for taking the time to be here with us at Belgahai and on Crossroads. I look forward to seeing you again in this studio at some point in the future. And thank you to our listeners for being with us today on Crossroads and with Marat Terterov.
Thank you, Nicholas. Thank you very much.